My father didn't even hesitate. In front of everyone. He laughed and said I'd never been good at anything. The room chuckled with him. I stayed quiet because the truth hit me harder than his words ever could after all these years. Ruby was still invisible in her own family, and in that moment, I knew this wound wasn't new. It was 20 years old, and finally too painful to ignore. The rain was coming down in a thin, steady sheet when I stepped out of my old car. The kind of soft March drizzle Portland is known for, quiet enough not to bother you, cold enough to slip beneath your collar. The glow from the Italian restaurant's front windows stretched across the pavement like a warm invitation, though I knew better than to believe it was meant for me. I stood there for a breath, gathering myself the way I always did before these family gatherings, then pushed through the door and into the familiar weight of a room that never seemed to have space for me. The small bell above the entrance chimed, and the first person to reach me was Aunt Anne, wrapping me in the kind of embrace I wouldn't get from anyone else tonight. Caroline turned, her smile polished and perfect, but her eyes flicked past me almost instantly, pulled back into the orbit of people already praising her newest achievement. My father, Edward, offered nothing more than a curt nod, the kind you give when checking off an item on a list. No warmth, no interest, just acknowledgement that I'd arrived. I slid into the last seat at the long table, feeling the distance between me and the rest of them more clearly than the linen napkin resting on my lap. Voices overlapped in excitement, new accolades for Caroline, another milestone, another article written about her. I kept my gaze low, letting my fingertips trace the seams of the napkin as if the fabric could anchor me. Not a single question came my way. It wasn't that they didn't know I was there, it was that, in their minds, there was nothing about me worth asking. A prickle on the back of my neck made me glance to the side. At the next table, an older man with a scholar's posture was studying me intently, Professor Keller. His expression suggested recognition, though I couldn't imagine from where. I offered him a polite, thin smile before returning to my glass of water, quietly steadying myself. Just one dinner. I told myself, you've survived enough of these. But something in my chest tightened a different kind of unease. Sharper, heavier, as if the room itself was warning me that tonight would not follow the script I'd grown used to, and I would soon learn it was right. This dinner was only the beginning, and the first crack in a door I had spent years trying to keep shut. The clinking of silverware blended into a soft, distant hum as my mind drifted far from the restaurant table. Moments like these always pulled me backward, back to the years when comparison had been the background noise of my life. I remembered sitting at our old dining table as my father praised Caroline with words that felt too big for the room. Words he never once used for me. Her grades, her awards, her promise he showcased them like pieces in a glass cabinet. And whenever he turned to me, it was only to hold her achievements against my quiet efforts, telling me I needed to push harder, as if my best was simply a softer version of hers. I spent my whole childhood waiting for a moment when he might look at me with even a fraction of that pride, but it never arrived. Each comparison chipped at me until I learned to make myself smaller, hoping it would hurt less. Voices around me swelled again, but my thoughts slipped to the one person whose approval had ever felt unconditional. My mother had always seen something in me that no one else bothered to look for. She used to cup my face in both hands and whisper that I had a heart that noticed what others walked past. She said it with a conviction that made me believe her, even if only for a few seconds. Now, staring at the empty place where she used to sit during family dinners, the loss hit with a weight that hadn't eased over the years. Surrounded by people, I felt strangely, painfully alone. Caroline's laughter snapped me back to the present. She was describing her new project at the university, eyes bright, hands moving with the confidence of someone used to being listened to. The table glowed with admiration. Compliments bounced from one person to the next. I clapped along like everyone else, but all I could see in my mind were the nights I'd stayed up past midnight working through student files, fighting for kids with nowhere else to go. No applause had ever echoed through the small office where I labored alone. My silence had made it easy for the family to assume what I did didn't matter. A gentle shift beside me made me turn. Aunt Anne leaned in, voice barely audible. Your mother kept every article that praised your program. She whispered. She showed them to me all the time. The words hit like a sudden warmth breaking through a cold front. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. No one else had ever acknowledged my work, not like that. I blinked hard, willing myself not to fall apart in front of the table still orbiting around Caroline. I took a sip of water to steady myself and let my eyes scan the faces around me. They were so focused on Caroline's shining future that I couldn't help wondering if they had ever looked at me through my mother's eyes. Would they have seen something different? The question lingered like a whisper inside me, unanswered, but impossible to ignore. My father stood then, raising his glass with the same ritualistic pride he had carried for decades. His voice rang with certainty as he introduced Caroline, delivering every carefully chosen word, as if presenting a guest of honor. I clapped again, the motion automatic, but when he shifted toward me, his tone thinned to something careless and almost dismissive. Ruby does something with students, or something like that, he said. A few guests glanced my way, confused. Even Caroline stiffened, her smile faltering for a heartbeat. She knew how that landed. She always knew. Yet, like so many times before, she said nothing. The table grew uncomfortably quiet, not from sympathy, but from indifference. No one asked what I actually did. No one even pretended to be curious. Their silence wrapped around me like a cold draft, and I felt myself shrink again, the way I had so many times before. A sudden clatter cut through the tension. I turned and found Professor Keller at the next table, staring at me with startled recognition. Ruby, Walton. My breath caught. I hadn't expected anyone here to know my name. His expression held genuine surprise, and for a split second, I felt seen, truly seen. He began to rise, but a server arrived with a tray, guiding him back into his seat. All I managed was a quiet nod, but at my table, nothing shifted. No one noticed. My father simply resumed speaking, already moving on, already forgetting the moment had happened at all. I drew in a long breath, feeling something inside me settle with sudden clarity. Whatever changed in my life would not begin here, not at this table, not with these people. If change was coming, it would come from the world that knew my name even when my family didn't. And with that realization, the first spark of conflict caught flame. 2 days after the dinner, I stopped by Aunt Anne's house to return the sweater I'd borrowed. She greeted me with her usual warmth, but something in her eyes flickered uncertainty, hesitation, almost guilt. She asked me to follow her into the kitchen. Her voice lowered as if she feared being overheard. On the worn wooden table lay a stack of crisp photocopies. The top page alone made my breath catch in my throat. Last will and testament, Walton family estate. I flipped to the next page, already knowing I wouldn't like what I found. Caroline's name was underlined boldly, in the sole beneficiary line. I searched for mine, even a footnote, a contingency, a passing mention. There was nothing, not a word, not a letter. It was as if I had never lived in that house, never shared a table with them, never been his daughter at all. I didn't care about money. I never had. But seeing my absence printed so starkly felt like watching someone carve out the space where I should have been and leave it blank. My chest tightened, the ache sharp enough to make me grip the edge of the table. Aunt Anne sat beside me, placing her trembling hand over mine. Ruby, your mother was proud of you, more than you ever knew. But your father, he refused to see it. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small, time-worn slip of paper. My mother's handwriting curled across the page, gentle and familiar. My daughter sees what others overlook. I wish her father understood that. The words blurred as tears hit the page. That single note held more love than my father had given me in years. My phone rang. His name flashed on the screen. I answered, hoping stupidly for something human. You're coming to Caroline's dinner tomorrow, right? Don't be late. People want to see her, not me, her. Later that night, I opened my laptop to drown myself in work. A new email appeared, Office of Dean Whitmore. Oregon State University. They needed to meet with me about the statewide scholarship program. At the bottom was a link. When I clicked it, my name appeared second on the nomination list for the Oregon Community Education Award. My own family couldn't see me. but the state did. I rested my hand on my mother's note and let the truth settle in. Something was coming, something I could no longer outrun. The next morning, I sat at my desk, opening student files one by one. Each folder held a life, hanging by a thread, kids without tuition, without documents, without mentors. I called advisors, wrote appeals, drafted recommendations. I worked straight through lunch, past dinner, into the late hours, the way I always did. No one in my family knew what any of this looked like, and they never asked. All I knew was that if I stopped, someone would fall through the cracks. In the middle of reviewing a case, my phone rang again. "This is the U.S. Department of Education. Washington, we're confirming your role on the pilot project advisory list." I froze. I had never imagined my work rippling far enough to reach Washington. A notification buzzed in. The family group chat. "Caroline, be early tomorrow. Someone from the university wants to meet me. Father." "Don't ask Ruby to help. Handle it yourself." The words hollowed me out. Years of effort, dismissed in a single line. That night, while searching for documents, I opened my archived folder and found an email Caroline had hidden. A nonprofit had wanted to collaborate with her because of my guidance. She'd deleted the evidence, letting everyone believe she had done it alone. Before bed, I reread the dean's message. At the bottom, the line I'd missed earlier. "We've reviewed your entire program since last July. 9 months, 9 quiet months of being seen by strangers while remaining invisible at home." When I finally turned off the lights, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. For the first time in a long while, I didn't just see sadness. I saw something steadier. Rising slowly from the wreckage, tomorrow's dinner wouldn't be like the last one. It couldn't be. I arrived at the restaurant right on time, just as my father had ordered. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew tonight wasn't like the last. The room was packed, distant relatives I barely remembered, Caroline's coworkers, and the important guests Dad wanted to impress. They stood in glowing clusters of conversation. When I walked in, a few people nodded out of politeness, cool, distant, uninterested. Only Aunt Anne came toward me, wrapping me in the kind of hug that kept me from feeling swallowed whole. Across the room, Caroline stood with a local reporter, radiant under the lights. The reporter scribbled notes while Dad hovered proudly beside her, tossing out words he would never use for me. When I approached, he barely glanced over. "Oh, Ruby's here too." No introduction, no invitation to join them, just that single flat acknowledgement. I stepped back, invisible once again. Then a voice burst across the room. "Ms. Walton, is that really you?" 3 students I had helped secure scholarships rushed toward me, hugging me tightly, thanking me like I was the only person who ever listened to them. Conversations around us stopped. People stared. A moment later, one student's mother approached, eyes wet. "Thank you. My daughter wouldn't be in school without you." Behind me, I felt my family freeze. My father's voice came out thin, unsure. "You know Ruby?" I opened my mouth, but he stepped in with a strained laugh. "Ruby just helps with little things. Nothing major." The silence that followed was sharper than any insult. I stepped into the hallway to breathe, and a server passed by, whispering, "Someone's coming for you tonight. They said they'll be here soon." I didn't know who, but I knew the storm was close. A sudden draft swept through the room as the door swung open. Conversations dropped a beat. I turned and a tall man with silver hair and a dark coat stepped inside. My breath caught. "Dean Harris Whitmore, here, tonight." My father was mid-sentence, saying to a group of colleagues, "Ruby, she still hasn't found anything she's truly good at." And then he saw everyone looking past him. The dean had stopped right behind him. Dean Whitmore met my eyes and said, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear, "Ruby Walton, I've been trying to reach you all week." Everything went still. Caroline almost dropped her glass. My father stiffened. From a nearby table, Professor Keller stood quickly and shook my hand. "Finally, I get to meet you. Your work is remarkable." Then the dean continued, his voice carrying across the room. "We'd like you to speak at the statewide scholarship launch." Gasps rippled through the tables. And then the core model for the new program is yours. Ruby! The room erupted into stunned silence. Caroline stared. My father's hand slipped off the back of his chair. Dean Whitmore rested a steady hand on my shoulder. This is your moment. And for the first time, the entire room finally saw me. The moment Dean said the statewide scholarship model was built on my idea, the entire restaurant seemed to harden into silence. The clatter of silverware, the low hum of chatter, even the soft music from the speakers, everything froze. People turned toward me in slow, almost synchronized movements, as if pulled by gravity itself. My father stood a few steps away, his face drained of color, lips parting but never forming words. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the girl tucked quietly at the edge of the table. I was the center of the room. Dean turned to me with a steady, respectful look and raised his voice so everyone could hear. Ruby, with your permission, I'd like to share more about your work. No one in my family had ever asked if I wanted to be heard. For a moment, my throat tightened. All around me, people waited, expected. I lifted my chin and gave a small nod, simple. But it felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd been taught to shrink. Dean stepped forward. Ruby proposed the bridge funding model that kept over 300 students in school last year. A soft gasp rippled through the room. She partnered with private foundations to double emergency aid funding. Murmurs rose surprise, disbelief, maybe even admiration, and her report is now under federal review for national expansion. Then Professor Keller joined him, his voice warm with sincerity. Without Ruby's analysis and design work, our project wouldn't have survived its first round. From the back of the room, a mother stood and spoke through trembling emotion. Ms. Walton saved my daughter. No one else listened. A father followed, adding, she changed hundreds of families' lives. Dean finally turned to my father. Mr. Walton, your daughter is someone any department would fight to have. My father said nothing. He couldn't. And in that suspended moment, one truth rose above all the noise. He had never seen me. But everyone else finally did. After the applause faded, the room slipped into a strange stillness, as if every sound had been drained from the air. People who'd barely noticed me earlier now looked at me with an unfamiliar mix of respect and curiosity. I turned toward my father. He immediately shifted his gaze away, unwilling to meet the truth that had just been laid bare. Caroline stood beside him with trembling hands, her lips pressed tightly together. Then I felt Aunt Anne's hand rest on my shoulder, steady and firm. It's time, she whispered, and I knew she was right. I couldn't stay silent anymore. My hands shook. But my voice didn't when I finally faced my father. I never asked you to be proud, I said quietly. I only ever wanted you to see what I tried to do. He didn't argue. He didn't deny anything. He just stood there, cornered by a truth he'd ignored for years. Caroline suddenly broke down, her voice cracking. Ruby, I knew what you did mattered. You helped me get opportunities. I knew it. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. I was scared. Scared Dad would realize I wasn't as perfect as he thought. Her confession hit harder than I expected. I reached into my bag and placed the copy of the will in front of my father. What would you have said if I found this after you were gone? His face drained of color. I was wrong, he whispered. I should have tried to understand you. I took a breath that felt like shedding a weight I'd carried forever. I'm not looking for your approval anymore. For the first time, he had no defense, only silence. It wasn't victory. It was release. A week passed in a blur, the kind that feels both quiet and life-altering. In my small home office, morning light fell across a newly signed partnership contract with Oregon State University. My name sat on the page with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. A few minutes later, an email arrived from the U.S. Department of Education. Congratulating me, my model had officially been selected for the national pilot. The screen glowed, but the clarity inside me glowed brighter. Caroline texted asking to meet. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because I no longer felt responsible for holding our relationship together. Even my father's long, halting message didn't stir the old ache. I read it, breathed, and realized the pain had finally lost its hold on me. That afternoon, Aunt Anne stopped by. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, yellowed envelope. "This is from your mom," she said softly. My throat tightened as I opened it. Inside was a note written in her familiar, gentle handwriting. "My Ruby, you don't need to be anyone else. Your heart is the most beautiful thing I've ever known." 3 lines yet, they unraveled years of trying to earn worth in places that had none to give. Tears fell onto the page, not from sorrow, but from a release I had chased for 2 decades. That evening, I drove to St. John's Bridge. Rain drifted down in a quiet Oregon mist as I stepped out and leaned against the railing. The Willamette River below moved steadily, like time carrying away the weight I no longer needed. I whispered, just loud enough for the night air to catch it. "I'm okay now." "Mom!" I didn't need validation. I didn't need apologies. I had finally chosen myself, and that was enough to walk into a life that was truly mine, 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 was truly mine,